we're back from traveling, wiser and thankfully not sad about it. Welcome everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Mere Mortals Book Reviews. I'm your host here, Kyron, live on the 16th of July 2025. And we're back, yes indeed, after a couple of months away traveling in Europe. I am back and I am going to be doing these live again. We do actually have some pre-recorded episodes from one coming out at roughly the same time as these are. And actually, that would be something I'd love to know. Do you like it if it's released back-to-back, day after day? Or do you prefer if it's got a bit of a break in between, like 3 or 4 days? Because at the moment, they're scheduled for the day after this is released. So you'll be getting 2 book reviews in 2 days. Wow, how lucky you are. As you might surmise, this is the podcast where I talk about the grim loneliness of life. Okay, we try. I mean, it can be grim and lonely at times, but that's not what this podcast is about. This podcast is about some book reviews. And I actually managed to get through a couple of books on my journeys, not as much as I perhaps regularly do whilst at home, but I did my best with my old Kindle here. And when I say old, I mean it is old. This thing is from 2012, 2012, I think, and still going reasonably strong. It's got a little bit of fading, and the battery doesn't last forever, but I mean, it's certainly enough for like a week's worth of reading before I need to recharge it. So pretty damn good. And what I usually put on these are things that I could find free online from stuff like Gutenberg, and so I'll upload a PDF or a Mobi file. So I was just going through essentially a whole bunch of older authors where they have released works on there. And I think I read 5 books in total. I'm going to go over 3 today in this special episode. That's because the themes were all relatively similar, and also because a couple of them weren't really worth a book review on their own. They're ones where I'd be like, I don't know if I really want to do a book review on this, because it was shorter. They were philosophical essays, and they're rather nihilistic as well. So it's like, let's just bundle this all into one big thing. And so the 3 books that I read were What Does It All Mean by Thomas Nagel, of What is Man and Other Essays by Mark Twain, and then The Foundation Pit by Andrey Platonov. So let's just get into them, and we'll go through them from my least favorite to favorite of them. And favorite is a strong statement, because I didn't even really enjoy the favorite of them. What Does It All Mean by Thomas Nagel. I ended up giving this a 4.5 out of 10. This was published in 1987, and that technically doesn't mean it's under the Gutenberg release, because that's for things that are out of copyright and whatnot. But this is a relatively short book, and I found it online somewhere anyway, so I was able to read through it. So this book is his attempt to lay a broad understanding of philosophy to people. The subtitle, A Very Short Introduction to Philosophy. So he does this through 10 questions, and these are things like, how do we know anything? Are there other minds? The mind-body problem, the meaning of words, free will, right and wrong, justice, death, the meaning of life, things along those sorts of lines. And he'll have a question related to, do we actually have free will? How could one measure this? What does free will even mean to someone? And look, my reading from it was, even though it is an open, short introduction to philosophy, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an easy one. I'd say this is probably only comprehensible to those with a IQ above the standard mean, because even though it's like the question itself is simple, I don't think he really answers it in a simple manner. And although I'd say my IQ is probably like 1 standard deviation above the mean, I'm certainly not the brightest of people out there. So even when I was going through this, I'm like, you know what, this isn't that good of an introduction to philosophy. So there was 9 questions, not 10, are indeed simple in nature, but complex in their implications. So even though you could ask, what is free will? There's been many, many books learnings, people pondering, pontificating, questioning over the ages. What does that mean? How are you actually going to cover that in a very short introduction? Well, you can, but it's you're not going to get very far nor very deep. As usual, from what I find with a lot of philosophy, is that the main takeaway is either nihilism or these kind of pointless circular arguments that they don't really resolve anything. I didn't come out from this going, okay, I've got more of an understanding on the nature of philosophy, the nature of meaning, of free will, of right and wrong, justice, death, anything like this. I come away with this with more questions, which is fine. That's what philosophy is kind of about. But whilst the questions in themselves are fun, the attempts to solve them or to bring more understanding to them, at least in this book, lack the levity or fun that actually make it worthwhile. Hence why probably the best philosophy book I've ever read is Batman and Philosophy. Because it's a humorous, not even humorous, it's an attempt to explain philosophy through these actual practical actions that Batman takes whilst fighting crime. You know, when he's fighting the Joker, you can understand about the trolley problem because he has to make a choice between killing one person dying or 5 people dying, and yet he himself has a moral dilemma in that. And so when you get things like the trolley problem explained in that context, I find it much more valuable. Whereas here, where it's just this very dry academic style, I didn't really get much out of it. It once again lacks the effectiveness of practicality, perhaps, that you'll find. Hence why in the Mere Mortals we have effective philosophy, which is really about philosophy that you can apply to day-to-day lives. If X is true, then Y behavior in real life do or don't make sense. And unfortunately, this book did not provide very much for that, so I cannot particularly recommend it, although it is short and you can get some of the basic questions of philosophical thought. So if it's your very first introduction, if it's the very first philosophy book that you're ever attempting, this is certainly better to read than something like Nietzsche or any of the other kind of classic philosophers, who I think by and large are largely, I'm not going to say full of shit, but incomprehensible and unhelpful in understanding more about the meaning of life and things like this. So that was the first book that I got through. I then came over, well, this was actually, in terms of reading, this was one of the later ones, but What is a Man and Other Essays by Mark Twain. For those who are in the book reviews world or the Mere Mortals book reviews world, you'll know that I am a rather big fan of Mark Twain. Life on the Mississippi, I think, is a fantastic book, and I've read probably about a third of his other works, his bibliography in total, having read most of the main ones, the main culprits of his, which everyone talks about, and I'm getting through his more lesser-known back catalogue gradually. And this was published in 1906. It embraces a couple of things. So What is Man probably takes up a third of the book, if not a little bit more, perhaps 2/5. And it is a Socratic dialogue between a young man and an elderly man about free will and kind of determinism, I guess. So it, as usual with these kind of Socratic dialogues, if you've read any of Socrates, you'll notice that it's very got a condescending attitude, because typically it will be an older man and then a younger man and his, disciple or pupil or someone. And it's rarely two equals on equal footing discussing ideas. It typically has this, the author uses this style to showcase their point of view and what they, I guess, believe or want to showcase in terms of philosophy. And what this does is it has this weird feeling where you're like, I don't feel like I'm getting the best of the other side of the argument. I'm getting a young man who doesn't perhaps know some of the tricks, the wiles of wordplay, of the deviations. Lawyers are very good at this, of going around a topic or obfuscating their real thoughts, or pushing things to the side or going down a side path that leads you nowhere when you're trying to ask them a relatively simple question. So this is kind of the feeling that I got from this. I'd actually find it more compelling if the younger man had more valid points or was a bit stronger in arguments, and essentially what the elder man was saying, that we are machines. It's very kind of deterministic, that it doesn't go to the point of saying we have no free will, but it certainly says that actions that you take are already kind of inbuilt into you, and that your environment has already trained you to act in a certain way. So if it is in a way saying, someone who is courageous, for example, deserves no praise. It'd be like praising a robot for being courageous, whereas we can say, oh no, well, we built that into the robot to be courageous, therefore it itself has not overcome. You can certainly say it did a good job, but you can't praise it for this action of overcoming a fear, of bettering itself, of changing itself. This is the kind of idea that is getting at in this What is Man? So that was, a decent section of the book. The rest are essays that deal with the death of his children and wife, for example, and whether Shakespeare was actually Lord Byron. He spends a crazy amount of time discussing that. And there was some mini extra little essays about German opera, for example, when he went to Nuremberg. And overall, whilst not totally nihilistic, I would say, and neither was the other book particularly nihilistic, there is a thing that happens when you listen to philosophy or read about it, and especially when it is investigating humans, and you typically will come to very similar conclusions or to ideas that, yeah, you know what, humans are largely machines, and that there is not that much free will associated with us. Or certainly, if you think you're at 100% free will, you're probably going to get down to saying, oh, okay, maybe we're at 10% free will, and even then, probably it's closer to zero. So, if not non-existent, we don't have free will. That is what a lot of philosophy tends to arrive at. And, we see, for example, the young man losing his beliefs and feeling there is no real hole to fill them. As free will disappears, everything essentially becomes deterministic and outside of your control. It has this feeling of inevitability, of hopelessness. And, nihilism as a philosophy in of itself is more directly related, saying, okay, there is no free will, therefore there is no meaning, therefore the right feeling to have in response to this is a hopelessness, is a depression. This book, for example, doesn't go that far. It's just saying, no, there's no free will. But the old man, for example, finds this liberating. And I think this can be true for some people. You can find a liberation in the fact, like, oh, perhaps you're addicted. You've got a vice of pornography, of alcohol, of sex, of, insert XYZ, anger, rage, any of these sorts of things which cause negative outcomes in your life. And you could, if you adopted this kind of stance and said, oh, you know what? This is outside of my control. I am largely dictated by these whims. And whilst that doesn't make it better, perhaps it's a way to forgive yourself of having some way of not feeling like I'm responsible for all of these bad actions that I'm taking, and shifting that responsibility onto your genetics or onto the universe. And perhaps that is a way of feeling less guilty about it, even if you still realize that your actions are bad and that you need or want to try and change them somehow. So it's kind of funny that that humans have this feeling that when meaning starts to grasp away, or our perception that we can control our lives or gain meaning, or that the universe has meaning, our lives have meaning, that we automatically tend to, by and large, have a hopelessness feeling related to this. And you can see this when people have their beliefs eroded away, whether that be that their wife is faithful to them and then they realize she's not, or vice versa, or perhaps religion, and they lose faith in their religion due to an experience outside of their control. Perhaps their baby dies or something, and they're asking, why was God so cruel as to allow this to happen? There is no God. Or perhaps they have something else traumatic happen to them, or they perhaps see that, for example, the Catholic Church and all of the disgusting pedophilic behavior and switching priests around so that the higher orders wouldn't get all of that sort of shit could perhaps make you lose your faith in the church and religion. All those sorts of things, when you lose meaning, when you lose those beliefs, it has this void within yourself that happens, a resignation of sorts. And what I have actually kind of noticed was perhaps this suits the energy of the elderly. So the elderly man, for example, he finds a comfort in this in some sort of respect. For him, it's just like, it's true, like there is no meaning in life, and that's okay. Whereas with the young man, it saps his energy. This is not something that is an energy giver, a belief or a system or a thought. And I also wonder if so Mark Twain wrote this in 1906, which was rather close to the end of his life. I believe he passed away 4 years after that, so in 1910. And he was an elderly man by that stage in his 70s, or very close to it. And he'd experienced a whole lot of suffering in his life, a lot of good things as well, which is what I love about him, because, he did travel the world. He was in the gold mines, and as a miner, he was a pilot on the Mississippi River. He was a journalist. He did all of these kind of like wacky, crazy, wonderful things. Yet, his son died when his son was like 6 months old or very young. 2 of his 3 daughters passed away before him. That's obviously a terrible thing for a parent to experience. His wife passed away before him. Many good friends passed away before him. Remember, this is the 1800s. If you're getting to like 70 to 80 years old, you're doing pretty well, and you're going to see many people in your life fade away before you do. And so I wonder if all of these losses in his life kind of contributed to this feeling that he was having. And, let's just put him as the elderly man in this case, that the understanding or this conclusion that he comes to of determinism or not having free will, it's perhaps nihilism that makes everything better for him because he's already feeling pretty terrible. He also had plenty of financial troubles in his life as well. The book was interesting because outside of the young man and the elderly man, the what is man essay, the others still had this spark of Mark Twain, which I love, which is this humor, this way of just, for example, when he's talking about these 2 camps of Shakespeare thought, which was that the man known as Shakespeare, the physical person, was the actual person who wrote it, whereas he's saying that none of this makes sense. I believe Lord Bacon was the man who actually wrote Shakespeare, because why was Shakespeare not known and underappreciated in his own time? And none of it makes sense, something along those lines. And so he's talking about this Shakespearean camp, and he was saying, like, my opponents would like to call names and would act high and mighty, but I would not revert to these sorts of low base behaviors. Yes, indeed, when these thugs, these like imbecilic morons, address a point, and so he's obviously being kind of like satirical and flipping the switch and saying he's going to be, a calm, measured person, and then throwing insults like that, which I love about Mark Twain. He's so funny. He's got a real nice twist to his humor. When he had plenty of that still within this book, but I would say out of all of the Mark Twain books that I've read, this is the most serious and dour of them. So you can certainly see this kind of nihilistic little bent to it that comes through. And then finally, we have The Foundation Pit by Andrey Platonov. This was published in 1973, so rather late, but he actually was writing the work in the 1930s, so 40 years beforehand. He was a Russian writer or a Soviet writer, and the reason it was published so much later was because of the book bannings, the censorship that was occurring in those times. And this is an extremely sad book. There's no getting around that. Almost from the get-go, you're like, oh, here we go. More Russian, mopey, suffering literature. Dostoevsky, reminiscent. Or Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago, all those sorts of things. So reading this book drives at the heart of what makes me afraid of large governments and organizations in general, to be honest. So, and even perhaps 400 years ago, the church would have been a government type thing here. So this story, it's fictional, tells about a Soviet Russia where workers are digging a foundation pit to serve as a housing for collectivization. What you get from it is everything is grey, everything is dreary. I can't remember. I think it talks about snow in it, so it is probably winter as well. So, cold, freezing, people barely struggling to stay alive. And we have these cast of characters. There's probably about 10 of them in total. And what do we see from these different types of characters? And remember, this is in the era of communism, so it's talking about this collectivization. We're going to work together as people. We don't trust the capitalist system, so people looking out for their own self-interest. We need to do things as groups, is essentially. So they're digging this big pit, and there's a bunch of workers in it. We have kind of different camps of them. So we've got the pure believers, who are the kind of strong workers who just believe the party doctrine, and they're digging the pit with all of their force, all of their might. So these are characters like the bear, or who's this just kind of mountain of a man, or Chiklin, who, and I'm mispronouncing these Russian names, I'm not going to get them right. They kind of survive due to their strong constitution and, I guess, an unwavering belief. But because of their belief and their constitution, they're essentially worn down to nothing. These people we don't see it in the book, but over years and decades, they will work their ass to the bone for their country, for the communism, for their people, for their fellow comrades. Yet they don't see any particular benefits for it, other than perhaps some praise. But they certainly don't get a rest. They certainly don't get better life experiences in terms of the physical pleasures of life, and a nice house, or they just work themselves, and they suffer rather gradually because of this. We see a different type of people who are the kulaks, and we see them getting liquidated within the book. They get forced to be put on a raft and sent down the river, and we don't know what happens to them, but presumably they die. And these are the proletariat who owned perhaps a small shack, or had 3 cows, or had just enough to be able to employ someone else to help them till their land, or something like this. And we also see this in Natsia, a young girl who dies of fever and has her mother starved to death in front of her. These are the people who are the extremely vulnerable, and they suffer devastatingly in terms of they die very quickly, not due to even having done anything wrong. It's just purely economic factors. They don't have a house over their head. They don't have warm clothes. They don't have enough to eat. And that is unfortunately one of the effects that this collectivization brings about, which is people, it was just a less efficient system. And so resources went to waste. and that's ended up what happening a lot, unfortunately. We also have these kind of believers, but they're kind of cruel. They're a bit nasty, and perhaps are a little bit not smart enough to kind of get ahead in life. And so these are people like the activist Safronov or his counterpart Kozlov, who hate each other, but they manage to get elected to the board of leadership because they are, following the party line to a T. They are working their comrades up into a fever of like, comrade, what are you doing? You're not working hard enough. Or comrade, we need to collectivize more harder. And they're much more in the kind of political realm, and less in the realm of actually doing the work. They want to inspire. Think of them as motivational speakers who are extremely extractive. I'm almost just describing normal motivational speakers who don't want to do any work. Yeah, very, very similar, but with a kind of nasty streak to them as well. They'll take pleasure in liquidating the kulaks. They'll take pleasure in being mean to people. And what ends up happening to them? Well, they incur the wrath, the ire of their communities, and those two in particular get murdered, which is in contrast to kind of the crafty version of these, who survive and even prosper, albeit with pain as well. So this would be someone like Comrade Pashkin, who is this bloated bureaucrat and who has a rather jealous wife, who is always watching out for other women because of his established position within the community. Or this vengeance-filled Zashev, who abuses his position as a cripple and therefore has some sort of political power because he is one of the unfortunates. Who it's very weird. So you can have a cripple who basically can do whatever he wants, because in the Soviet system or communistic system, he was viewed as a kind of like a special person who the collectivization was really meant to help, to each his ability, from his ability to each of his needs. I always screw that up. Essentially, because he had zero ability, he needed more. So he was the one who could get free food, or tasty cream, which was in short supply, or a helping hand, even though other people were like working their ass to the bone. They would still have to help him in some certain respect. And he uses this to bully people around, to take kind of unfair advantage of them in some certain respect, even though he's the cripple. He's the one in position of power, which is rather interesting. And so he survives and prospers, and so does Comrade Pashkin, but they still have their troubles. So, what do you get from this book? Well, everyone's suffering, and the characters who I found the most interesting had the most interesting insights, and this is where the philosophy and nihilism comes in. Voshev, who was, I guess, the main character, because the book's told and starts from him and mostly is told around his actions, joining the Foundation pit after kind of being a bit of a nomad wanderer. And to a lesser extent, I believe his name was Prushevsky, and who was the engineer. They were men searching for meaning in a rather bleak world. So we encounter this world where, yes, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of people hurting, and Voshev in particular is trying to understand this, like what's going on, why is this happening, and his oscillations are, I guess, a point of interest in the story, and funnily enough, other people's reactions to his dilemma are interesting as well. So they chastise him for being a dreamer, for dreaming too much and not putting that energy into work, but they don't accuse him of being a plunderer or of wrecking or of treason, which can happen in these sorts of cases. They kind of see his questioning and they don't understand why he just doesn't fit into the system, even though the system is broken, causing a lot of pain and suffering, and his own questioning of this, of where is the meaning of life? Why are we doing these things? What does any of this matter? Is only increasing his mental suffering. And for everyone else, sure, they've got the physical suffering, but the mental suffering is not there because they're by and large believers. We believe in the system of collectivization. Everything's going to be all right. We're going to live in this big foundation pit, in a big collective house, which the foundation pit is the base of. It's kind of this metaphor of the foundation pit growing ever larger to house all of the world, because as people encounter more problems, they decide, well, we need to build the pit bigger, because the problems are just magnifying like in infinitum. So I guess overall, what's to be learnt from these books? Honestly, digging at the heart of meaning, of life, of why are we here, or what does my life mean, it can be rather destabilizing and cause a lot of mental suffering. The realizations of the people, of the characters, of myself reading this, of other people reading this, of the general tendency of a lot of philosophy when you're doing these questionings, whilst they satisfy a curiosity, I don't think they necessarily make you happier. Almost certainly don't make you happier. And whilst they are fascinating, and I'm continually drawn to them, and I continually read these philosophy books, even though by and large I found them useless, there's a curiosity, I guess, perhaps is what you'd call it, or a searching. And am I particularly searching for something for myself? No, but I still enjoy looking after new ideas, in particular, new ways of thinking. It's why I've delved into a lot of the religions of the world. Why, in particular, I find a lot more meaning in the Eastern types rather than the Western types. And there is just something that, whilst not nihilistic in the sense that it doesn't necessarily equate into mind that there is no meaning and therefore that's a bad thing and that you should feel bad about it. That is just what tends to happen, and I don't know why. Perhaps it's because the lessening of meaning gives of this feeling of hopelessness. Perhaps it is very difficult to replace a belief or a meaning system in your life, and so sometimes perhaps it's better to remain ignorant intentionally, which is kind of what I did, to be honest. Like, going through all of these books, I did not come out of these sadder or worse for my life. I was just going, oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, cool, nice book. I gave this one, for example, the Foundation Pit, a 5.5 out of 10. None of these particularly have affected me or made me really ponder and think. Perhaps because I've just read so many books similar to these in my life that they didn't provide any new insights, because I've seen this before. I've seen plenty of philosophy and the type of effects it can have, not only on myself but on the characters within the book. So it was not novel nor exciting to me. So yeah, that's just some philosophical thoughts, some ramblings of essays, and if you got any enjoyment from this, well, kudos to you, because most people don't, especially the characters in the books. So we've gone on long enough. Let's jump into the last sections here. There's a value for value podcast, which essentially means I'm going to produce this free. It's never going to be ads or sponsorships on these episodes, nor any ulterior motives of why I am reading these particular books. These are books that I just found, and I am reading them for the pure enjoyment and learning that you can get from them. So what do I ask in return for all of this value that I'm providing you? I just ask that you give me something back, and you can do this in many different ways. Time, talent, and treasure. Time, spend the time to join me on a live book review. I'm doing these live again, 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday. Put that into your AI and ask it what that is in your local time, and it'll show up. And so, liking, subscribing, commenting is great. Give me some book reviews. What are some things that you really enjoy? What is your favorite book of all time? What do you suggest that I read in terms of classic books or in terms of books that are perhaps not well known? I would love to know all of those things. And then finally, if you want to send in some treasure, aka money, you can do this via any of the links down below. We've got a PayPal account where you could do that. There is also joining via any of the podcasting apps which allow you to stream bits of Bitcoin in, such as Fountain, Podfans, called True Fans nowadays. I saw Lyceum, one of our supporters, doing that recently. Thank you very much, my friend. Of also Podcast Guru, Cast-O-Matic. There's quite a few different ones out there. If you want to know more about that, go to meremortalspodcasts.com/support and you'll be able to do that. What's coming up? What is coming up? Well, as I mentioned, Juan's got a couple of pre-recorded book reviews. I also have 2 more books which I have read whilst traveling and will be doing, and then I'm getting back into the normal swing of things. These 2 are Reminiscences of a Stock Operator by Edwin Lefebvre, and then on a very similar bent was The Wizard of Wall Street and His Wealth by Trimble White. So these are dealing with people who were in the stock market in the United States of America during the early 1900s, late 1800s period, and it's rather fascinating tales. So look forward to that. Other than that, I really hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are in the world. I'm tuning out, and regular book reviews coming back for at least the next half a year, I imagine. And yeah, really hope you can come and join me for them. Ciao for now. Karen out. Bye.